Hi everyone, today we're looking at Unit 5, Lesson 6, Completing the Square, Part 2. So yesterday we just started to look at the process of completing the square. Today we're going to continue looking at that. This time we're going to look at it when we have a quadratic in standard form and our a value is something other than 1. How do we go about completing the square for that kind of situation? So we're going to start by looking at an example. We have a quadratic here that is 2x squared plus 8x. I'm going to get you guys just to factor. So if we think about how would we factor this quadratic, we always want to look for a common factor first. So I'm going to common factor whatever I can out of here first. So I know by looking at this that I can common factor out a 2x, and I'll be left with x plus 4. Okay, so we know that when we're in factored form, we can find our solutions or we can find our zeros. So we would have 2x equals 0, and we would have x plus 4 equals 0, and then we would solve for x. So we would have x equals 0 or x equals negative 4. These are our zeros or our solutions. Okay, those are our solutions. If we were going to graph just our zeros for now, we know that we have a 0 at negative 4, and we know we have a 0 at 0. Okay, that's all we have right now. We know that we have a parabola that's going to open up because our a value is positive, so we can maybe do a rough sketch of our parabola. It's going to look something like that, but it's just a rough sketch. We don't have any idea what that vertex is right now. We could, of course, find out with our zeros, but we're going to use that process we talked about yesterday for completing the square to get this standard form of a quadratic into vertex 4. So this time I'm just going to rewrite our equation, y equals 2x squared plus 8x. Okay, and to start the process for completing the square, we want to create a standard equation that has an a value of 1. So there's no coefficient in front of my x squared. So we're going to start by common factoring. We're going to common factor the numerical coefficient of x squared. So we're going to common factor, when they say the numerical coefficient, they mean our a value. So whatever a is, we're going to common factor that out. Just a. We're not going to common factor it out in x this time. We're just going to common factor out a 2. So we're going to common factor only the a value. Okay, so I'm going to common factor out just 2. I'm going to leave everything else inside. So I'll have x squared plus 4x. Should be an x. Okay, so now yesterday we looked at how we can complete the square. So I just want to point out that the reason that we didn't want to common factor out that x is because we need that power of 2 in order to create our perfect square trinomial, right? We need an exponent to create a perfect square trinomial. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to work to create a perfect square trinomial. So we did this first. Okay, step 2. We're going to take that b term, just like we did yesterday. We're going to cut it in half, and we're going to square it. And then that's going to get added to my equation. So we're going to have y equals 2, and then x squared plus 4x. And if we take 4 divided by 2 and we square it, well, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to add 4, and I'm going to subtract 4. Okay, so I'm working to create that perfect square trinomial. So these first 3 terms, those are going to be my perfect square trinomial. That's what we're trying to create there when we complete the square. So we have a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so if I were to factor that, we'll say that we're going to factor that now. we would take the square root of my first term and the square root of our third term, and that's what goes in our brackets. So the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 4 is 2. And then whatever sign is in the middle there goes between the two, and we have a squared. Okay, and then we have a minus 4. And that minus 4 was inside of our brackets as well. So we still have to kind of deal with that minus 4. We have to bring this minus 4 outside our brackets. And we have to bring it outside our bracket so that we're simplifying our vertex form. Okay, well right now that minus 4 is attached to the 2 that is multiplying everything inside that bracket. So when we bring it outside the bracket, we're going to have to multiply by that 2. So what I mean is we're going to have y equals 2, and then we're going to have still x plus 2 squared. But if I'm writing that minus 4 outside my brackets, I'm going to have to then multiply it by 2 because it's connected to that 2 on the outside of my brackets. So we will end up with y equals 2 times x plus 2 squared minus 8. So that tells me that therefore my vertex is going to be at -2, -8. So if we came back up to our graph, we could say our vertex is right there, -2, -8, right? And that makes sense for that graph we drew. We're over 2 and then down 8. Yep, that works with that graph. Okay, so by completing the square, we can determine that vertex. So let's walk through the steps for how we complete the square when we have an a value that's something other than 1. So step 1, we're going to remove the common factor from x squared and x terms. And just remember, number only, right? We don't pull out any variables. So if I pull out my a value, so a equals 3, that's what we're going to common factor out from our first two terms. So we're going to common factor out that a from our first two terms. We're going to have y equals 3, and then we'll have x squared plus 10x. And then I'm going to leave some room in my bracket because we're trying to create that perfect square trinomial. So we have to think about what are we gonna add and subtract in there when we're creating that perfect square trinomial. So that was step 1. So step 2 says find the number that must be added and subtracted to complete the squared. So it says divide the value next to the x term by 2 and square it. So divide the value next to the x term by 2 and square it. So that's our b term. So we're going to divide the value next to our x term, which is b. Let's do this. We'll write b there. So divide the value next to the x term by 2 and square it. Okay, well, my b is 10. So we're going to half and square it. So we're going to take 10 divided by 2, and then we're going to square that. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So I'm going to add 25 inside my bracket, and I'm going to subtract 25 inside my bracket. So this value here is what goes inside my bracket. We add and we subtract that 25. Okay, it says move the subtracted value out. So we did step 2. Move the subtracted value outside the brackets. Don't forget to multiply by the common factor. So we're going to move the subtracted value outside the brackets, and we're going to multiply by the common factor. Okay, so let's try that. So we're going to have y equals 3 x squared plus 10x plus 25. And then I'm going to move this minus 25 outside my brackets. But when I do that, I have to multiply by that common factor of 3. And then we have minus 7. All right, so that's step 3. Finally, we're going to factor the perfect square. and collect the constants into a single value, the numbers, which are the numbers at the end of the expression. Okay, so if we were to factor our perfect square trinomial we just created, okay, we take the square root of our first term and the square root of our last term. So the square root of my first term is x, the square root of that last term is 5, and there's a plus on our b, so that's what goes in between. We'll have x plus 5 squared. And then we have a negative 25 times 3 is a negative 75 minus 7. So we can just combine those. Negative 75 minus 7 is a negative 82. So that would be that complex quadratic or complex trinomial written in vertex form after completing the squares. Let's look at a few more examples. Okay, so for the next one, it says complete the square. So step 1, we're going to factor out a. Okay, so if I common factor out a, that means I'm common factoring out a negative 10. I'll be left with w squared. I'm going to move this over a little bit. I need a little bit more room. I'm going to common factor out a negative 10. So I'll be left with w squared. And 500 divided by negative 10 is going to be a negative 50w. I'm going to leave some room in my bracket for that value that I'm going to add and subtract. And then we have that plus 750. Okay, step 2 is we're going to half and square our b value. So we're going to take 50, we're going to divide it in half, and we're going to square it. Well, 50 divided by 2 is 25, and 25 squared is 625. So now I'm going to add 625. I'm going to subtract 625. So that 625 gets added and subtracted into our equation. Okay, the next step is we're going to remove that negative 625. So we're going to have a negative 10 w squared minus 50w plus 625. Now I'm going to bring that negative 625 outside my brackets, but here's what's important. We have to remember to multiply by that common factor of negative 10. Now we have plus 750. So if we take the factors of this perfect square trinomial, let's just label this though. This was step 3. Okay, this is step 4. So let's factor this w squared minus 50w plus 625. Take the square root of our first term and the square root of our third term. So the square root of w squared is w, and the square root of 625 is 25. And the sign that's in the middle goes in the middle of these brackets. So we'll have w minus 25 squared. Okay, then we just have to simplify all these constants outside of our brackets. So negative 625 times 10 is a positive 6,250 plus 750. So we'll have negative 10 w minus 25 squared plus 7,000. Okay, we'll take a look at one more. This one involves decimals, but when we common factor something out, we should be working then with whole numbers. So let's give this one a try. So, number 1, we're going to common factor out a. Okay, but again, it's just from the first 2 terms. I'm going to underline that in our other example as well. We only took a out from those first 2 terms. We don't take it out from all of them because we're trying to create a perfect square trinomial with those first 2 terms. Okay, so if I common factor out a, well, my a value is 0.1. So if I take that out, I'm going to be left with x squared. And when I take 0.6 and divide it by 0.1, that equals 6. And then we have that plus 1.1. And again, I'm going to leave some room in my bracket so we can add and subtract whatever number we need to in there. Plus 1.1. Okay, so step 2, I'm going to take my b value, I'm going to half it, and I'm going to square it. So half of 6 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So I'm going to take my 9, and I'm going to add and subtract it here inside my bracket. So plus 9 minus 9. Okay, so that was step number 2. Step number 3, we're going to remove that negative 9 to the outside of our bracket. So I have 0.1 times x squared minus 6x plus 9. So I've created that perfect square trinomial. And then I'll take my minus 9 out, but making sure to multiply it by my common factor of 0.1 on its way out. And then finally, we are going to square or factor that perfect square trinomial. So x squared minus 6x plus 9 is going to be x minus 3 squared. And then we'll start to simplify our constants. So a minus 9 times 0.1 is going to be a minus 0.9 plus 1.1. I lost my y equals along the way. I'll have 0.1 x minus 3 squared plus 0.2. So now you've written that in vertex form. So similar to the note from yesterday, but when our a value is something other than 1, we have to remember to common factor that out first. That is all for your note for today.